Hello! Today we're continuing with our look back at Final Fantasy character designs, with a look today at Final Fantasy IV's Cecil Harvey. Now, Cecil and Final Fantasy IV are notable for a number of reasons, and I think if one were asked what the most classically Final Fantasy game they can think of is, Final Fantasy IV would definitely be in the conversation there, since it was a game where the series truly came into its own in terms of character development and storytelling, maturing its gameplay, its job classes, in service of story, and really brought all of these elements of high fantasy fellowship in line with science fantasy tropes that persist into the present day. Now, looking to Cecil and Cecil's design as a part of these changes, and this successful synergy between gameplay elements and narrative elements, I think he remains one of the most distinct and transformative heroes to appear in a Final Fantasy game to date, because events that transpire during his character arc echo out into his gameplay abilities, and as we will see here today, his design attributes too. And really, I think this transformation of a character's role has only really been equalled by the recently discussed Lightning, though of course she has had a trilogy of games through which to undergo that and have these visual changes occur, while Cecil's was undertaken over one game. Although of course we have Final Fantasy IV The After Years, where his design changes and his arc changes slightly there, if you'd like to include that more kingly rement that he has in his design there too. It's also notable that Cecil is the first character design I've discussed here that preceded the role of Tetsuya Nomura as a character designer, and so he was ostensibly the work of both the renowned Yoshitaka Amano as a concept artist and Kazuko Shibuya, who is an excellent, though slightly lesser renowned and lesser discussed graphic designer and UI designer at Square, where she's responsible for a lot of the chibi style designs that we've seen over the years, and particularly the designs that we see on the packaging for both Final Fantasy IV and Final Fantasy V, which obviously have a bit more of a closer fidelity to how the pixel characters were rendered on the screens in this 16-bit era. So, jumping right in, looking at the design attributes of Cecil, as mentioned, we have a classic Final Fantasy feel from a time when these games were still very much ingrained in distinct character classes and still hybridizing their look and feel with more European or Western high fantasy tropes, so armoured knights, bricks and mortar castles, and so on. And at the beginning of the game, we find Cecil in the guise and the class of a Dark Knight, which is a design trope that had quietly established itself within Final Fantasy, alongside the more renowned and identifiable classes such as the Black Mage or the White Mage. And its first appearance was with Leon in Final Fantasy II, and also as an optional job in Final Fantasy III. But the incarnation seen in Cecil in Final Fantasy IV is perhaps the most famous iteration of the Dark Knight identity, and in many ways became the blueprint of its design in the few instances that it has featured since. So the primary design features of Cecil's Dark Knight, as seen in Final Fantasy IV, is a quite ominous full-body covering of plate armour and helm, which obscures virtually all of Cecil's features, excluding in some cases his mouth, or his mouth and face in the case of the 3D remake. But referring to Yoshitaka Amano's concept art, who was the main character designer at the time, the Dark Knight armour was intended to be this all-encompassing, ominous armour, and was coloured in an off-black, just slightly highlighted with a bluish-purple tint, as Amano envisioned it, and this followed through to his pixel art in the original game, where the Dark Knight armour is a shade of purple. The most iconic aspect of the armour is the whiplash curves and the spikes that we see painted in by Amano on the shoulder plates and the helm, and this has very much become the staple and stuck with the Dark Knight class pretty much ever since. So the spikes combined with the dark hues gives this instantly menacing vibe to the armour, and although I love the design and how it's improved in fidelity over time with the remakes and up into adaptations such as Dissidia and more modern appearances of Cecil, it is quite amusing to me that it took Cecil so long to realise that maybe he's a bad guy, and it reminds me of this Mitchell and Webb sketch where there's two soldiers wearing Waffen SS uniforms with the Totenkopf skulls on the cap, and they start questioning whether they might be the baddies. But for Cecil's part, I think the severe design of the Dark Knight, it's quite important that the design was this extreme in its depiction, because Final Fantasy IV's core arc is in many ways to do with Cecil's growth and transformation as a character, and the contrast between the Dark Knight and the Paladin, quite literally light and dark, made this all the more obvious. And I think it's very much the same as other character arcs that we might see in the series. And I've discussed in the past, for example, Squall Leonhardt, who's very often been critiqued for his closed-off demeanour in the first half of the game. But the point of that was they needed to present him as that extreme in his isolation to make the payoff of him opening up, finally, to Renoa and the other party members down the line that much more important and rewarding and pivotal to his character arc. So Cecil's Dark Knight demeanour, prior to him becoming a Paladin, is basically the visual equivalent of that. They needed to present something that was very extreme in its depiction to really have that payoff down the line. So in all, it's a very iconic design for the Dark Knight that sets up and establishes the first stanza of Cecil's story and Cecil's personal internal dilemma. And as I say, the whole approach to Cecil's design is unique in how directly related to narrative and indeed gameplay it is, with Cecil's weighting towards physical attacks and darkness in the guise of the Dark Knight being very apparent in his battle gameplay. Now, a pivotal part of Final Fantasy IV's story, which I talk about in depth, and I've done a retrospective on Final Fantasy IV on the channel, is Cecil's transformation at Mt Ordeals, where he must combat his shadow self and relinquish the rank of Dark Knight to acquire the redemptive light of Holy. And this is a pretty significant milestone for a Final Fantasy protagonist at this point in time, and I think it more broadly marks a turning point and a new complexity and maturity in Final Fantasy's storytelling that really set Final Fantasy IV apart in the series to date. But in terms of design, it was also pivotal in being one of the only examples to this day where the entire aesthetic of a Final Fantasy hero transforms, and indeed their gameplay transforms in response to an aspect of plot. So interesting design changes occur with Cecil, and some players to this day sort of dislike it. I have seen some criticisms there, because he's gone from this cool-looking Dark Knight armour replaced by something more light and whimsy. Indeed, some might even say a certain androgyny. But this step change, particularly on old 16-bit consoles, where we're dealing with pixel art, and it did need to be very stark and obvious to communicate the emotional and thematic change to players. And again, the changes to Cecil's design does vary from version to version, from SNES through to PS1, PSP, up of course into the 3D remake and Dissidia. And indeed, his Paladin form is probably one of the most adapted and consistently shifting designs that we've seen in a Final Fantasy hero over time. So first up, looking back to the beginning with the concept art and Yoshitaka Amano, his version of Cecil in his early work has been more closely adhered to in later years. But here we see a complete U-turn in Cecil's design, with the Dark Knight armour being replaced by bright white hues, some more open flowing attire rather than this closed off confining dark armour. So we have this long flowing cape, Cecil has flowing white hair, his face is completely visible and unencumbered by armour, so a certain liberation there. And indeed, he's not wearing gloves. And in my pedantry, I have noted that along with Firion from Final Fantasy II and Terra from Final Fantasy VI, he is one of the only protagonists in Final Fantasy who doesn't wear gloves. But all of this combines to emphasise the liberation of his character from the prior containment of the dark armour before, and the overtly white and red colour palette that Amano chose is a complete contrast to the blackish blue of his earlier design. And while yes, it has been criticised, as I say, I think it has a very Amano take on what a conventional Prince Charming sort of knight might appear like. And I think he sought to emphasise this, and emphasise this sort of chivalry and salvation and this breaking from the past that this hero character has achieved now that they've kind of adopted the light of Holy. Now, coming to Cecil's rendering in the actual game, there are some changes here, and changes that have evolved over time, as I say, to more closely reflect what Amano depicted in his concept art. But in the SNES version, through to the PlayStation 1 version, we actually have something that was a bit closer to the Dark Knight version. So he's retained, for example, the purple hue. So he has purple hair. I'm not sure why that is, whether they were trying to be sparing with the colours on the screen or create some semblance of consistency between the two character designs. But it is chiefly his light armour and his cape, and most importantly his diadem, which became a staple of the Paladin class thereafter, that really distinguishes him in the pixel art of the 16-bit games. Coming into later versions, up to the 3D remake, we now have Cecil that's much closer to Amano's vision of him, and here we can see his Paladin armour does retain some hints of his earlier form, such as having flowing spikes kind of coming out of the shoulder plates and stuff like that. But I think it really emphasised his spectacular white plate armour that he dons to replace his earlier one, and I really love the FMV sequences they created featuring Cecil, and also his depiction in Dissidia, which really kind of conveys that stuff quite well. But what I think is really significant with how Cecil's Paladin form has developed and consolidated over time to the iconic version that it is today is how the developers actually abandoned both Amano and Shibuya's earliest versions of him, where he adopted a red and white palette, and they went instead with a soft bluish hue instead. And generally, although I respect concept artists and you know, I kind of like a faithfulness to their vision to a degree, I actually really respect and actually prefer the design decisions that were made later down the line. Because if we look at the essence of the Paladin, this holy knight class, this sense of light and of purity, I think that comes through much better with these light blue colours that are kind of closer to white on the colour wheel. And thus, they do have a sense of sort of purity to them, rather than red, which actually might be considered more of an active, aggressive sort of colour that actually, as I discussed recently with Orin from Final Fantasy X, we might associate with aggression, Mars, the god of war, and all of that sort of stuff that's bound up with Orin's character that I discussed there. So actually quite a nice inadvertent contrast here now that we're discussing Cecil instead. So in all, very interesting kind of character developments and visual developments that went alongside the character of Cecil there. And I've just always loved how they sort of made that pivotal design change and gameplay change with him that really, I think, set Final Fantasy IV apart. So there we have it, quite a top-level view of Cecil Harvey's design over the years, and a consideration of a character who was really quite pivotal in how Final Fantasy games were written and how they synergised story and gameplay with design. If you got this far, thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. And if so, please consider subscribing to the channel, which will keep you updated with my latest posts.